Okay, guys, I'll start this video. This will be our first lecture of Unit 7, so we're getting close to the end. This will be one of our last, let's see, we've got 4 lectures left, including this one. So 2 in Unit 7, 2 in Unit 8, the 2 in Unit 7, obviously this one being the respiratory system, and then the other one is the digestive system, and then Unit 8 will have urinary system and then reproductive systems. Now, as far as Unit 7 goes, even though there are only 2 lectures that are part of it, the digestive system, there's a lot of organs and components that make it up. So the number of questions that will come on the exam for that lecture will be 40 questions, 20 over the respiratory system, just like any other. So exam number 7 will be a total of 60 questions. We'll talk about digestive system in our next video, but let's go ahead and just dive in on the respiratory system. So respiratory system, 3 major functions. Number 1 probably being kind of the most prominent, most important, provides for gas exchange, gases being oxygen coming into our lungs and then being taken up to our or into our blood, where it then is transported to our body, or to our cells, excuse me, throughout our body by way of the bloodstream. We just got done talking about the cardiovascular system. So we transport that oxygen to the cells that need it, because that's how we make ATP, energy that our cells all need. And then in that same process where we make that energy, we produce CO2, a byproduct, a waste product that we must expel off, which we carry to the lungs to be then exhaled out. In doing so, releasing CO2 actually helps us regulate our acid-base balance, because if CO2 accumulates in our body, it becomes acidic because it combines with water and forms an acid. Number 2 there is listing off how the respiratory system helps regulate acid-base balance. The third function actually is a collection of functions that are kind of secondary. Within our nose are the receptors for the sense of smell. We filter inspired air, we produce sounds from vocalization, and we excrete small amounts of water and heat every time we breathe. Speaking of breathing, that's one of the 3 things that's listed here as far as the term respiration goes. Breathing, also known as the ventilation of our lungs, is just one of the components of respiration. Other components include the exchange of gases between air and blood, so that takes place in our lungs, and then in our tissues, between our blood capillaries in our tissue fluids, where we also exchange gases. And then in our cells, we use that oxygen to go through cellular metabolism. In other words, that's where we produce ATP. Some of that takes place out in the cytosol through the process of what we call glycolysis. For the most part, most of our energy is produced in what we call powerhouses. You guys are all familiar with the mitochondria. We talked about that at the very beginning of the semester, but that's not something we're going to get into in this class. As far as the structures go, we'll kind of lump them a couple different ways, just like we do in a lot of the systems. There are 2 what we call tracts that make up our respiratory system, an upper and a lower. The upper includes the nose, your nasal cavity. Probably should throw in your mouth, but for whatever reason the book doesn't list it, so I didn't list it. But we do breathe obviously through our mouth. Divisions of the pharynx, there are 3 divisions of the pharynx. We'll talk about that, and then any associated structures, which are bracketed off here in this picture on the left. The lower respiratory tract is just basically everything below that, which includes your larynx, trachea, all segments of your bronchial tree, and then your lungs. So that's kind of the way that we divide it structurally. Another way to divide the respiratory system up is based on its function into what we call a conducting zone and a respiratory zone. Conducting zone is responsible for filtering, warming, and moistening our air, and then conducting it into the lungs. So that includes the nose, nasal cavity. Like I said, you could throw mouth in. Pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles. These bronchi, bronchioles, terminal bronchioles are branches of the bronchial tree, which you can see in our picture here on the left side. We can see it's like a tree, little tiny branches coming off and getting smaller and smaller. We'll talk about all those different types of tubes here in a couple slides. The respiratory zone, this is where gas exchange actually takes place. Most notably, it's in structures called alveoli, which I always think of like little grapes inside of our lungs. Our lungs are loaded up with tons and tons of these, each of which is a circular structure surrounded by pulmonary capillaries, which are the capillaries that are in our lungs, and this is where gases are going to be exchanged. So oxygen enters the blood here, CO2 leaves the blood to be exhaled out. Just like grapes, which are nice and round, they're found in clusters. Okay, a cluster of grapes is called an alveolar sac. You can see here's an alveolar sac. This would be another sac. Here's another sac. And like grapes and clusters, they have little stems. That's kind of what alveolar ducts are. It's what connects these alveolar sacs to your last branches of the bronchial tree, what we call our respiratory bronchioles. Now, as far as the pictures go, this is actually from a different textbook. This is the textbook version of essentially the same picture. I like this one a lot better because, I pointed out a lot of things they show. This one just really is fairly simple. It does show some things that this one doesn't, like, some of these paranasal sinuses that I'll talk a little bit about. Shows the, we can see the lobes of the lungs, but neither picture is really that, impressive or anything, so I wouldn't worry too much about them for your exam. All right, we're going to start here with the nose and then work down into the lungs towards the end. So nose is something we've talked about, previously quite a bit, leading back to when we discussed the cranial bones and the facial bones. We learned about, the nasal bones, learned about the nasal septum, the wall that separates the two sides, so on and so forth. And we've talked about the nose as recently as just a few weeks ago when we talked about the act of, smelling, when we were talking about special senses. So some of these things are going to be review quite a bit, though here is brand new. So let's get into it. Two kind of distinct regions make up the nose, the internal and external parts. External nose, internal nose, both built to help filter, warm, moisten, and then, as we know, smell is where we chemically examine the air that enters our body. Our external nose portion of the nose visible on the face consists of supporting framework of bone, hyaline cartilage. It's covered with muscle and skin, and is lined on the inside by mucous membrane. As far as bones go, the frontal, so that's the singular bone, the two nasals, and the maxillae, which are your upper jaws, form what we call the bony framework. Okay, so maxilla don't only form your upper jaws; they kind of project upwards here, almost towards your eye socket and nose. So they kind of form this kind of lateral wall. Frontal bone forms kind of the upper, part right there between your eyebrows. So, really the top of your nose. But as far as, actual bony part of your nose, externally, it's the nasal bones. The rest of what we can see, what we can feel, what we can wiggle around is nice and flexible because it's made up of cartilage. And so the cartilaginous framework consists of your septal nasal cartilage. That's the kind of rubbery, flexible wall in the middle of your nose inside, and dividing it into the two sides, left and right. And then you've got the lateral cartilages, which are inferior to the nasal bones, and then the alar cartilages, which form a portion of the walls of your nostrils. Final structure of your external nose is composed of dense fibrous connective and adipose tissues. On the inner surface of the nose, it's not labeled, but your openings, would be known as your external nares, or what we just call nostrils. And so those are the openings into your nose from the exterior. So that's why they're called external nares. The word nares in that form with an E is plural, naris, I. Instead of an E would be a singular form. So if you see it that way, it's the same thing, it's just this is plural. That would, if it's with an I, it's singular. Internal nose is large cavity beyond the nasal vestibule. Talk about what that is here in a minute. In the anterior space of the skull lies inferior to the nasal bones, really should say S here, and superior to your mouth. It's lined with muscle and a mucous membrane. Anteriorly, our internal nose is going to merge with the external nose, and then posteriorly it connects with the pharynx, which is your throat, and the two openings that lead to that are called your internal nares. So external nares with openings into the nose, deep in the nose, which your nose goes pretty far back in there into your throat. The openings from your internal nose to your throat are called internal nares. Once again, same thing. If you replace it with an I, singular. Another term for this is choanine, which is a fun word to say. Associated with your internal nose, we've talked about these are ducts connected to paranasal sinuses, like your frontals, your maxillaries. We'll talk about those here on the next page. As well as your nasolacrimal ducts, which are what carry tears from your eyes into your nasal cavity. When we cry, that's why our nose runs. We've talked about that before. Space within your internal nose is called your nasal cavity, divided into left and right sides, as we've talked about. Each side has a nasal vestibule. This is the anterior portion just inside the nostrils. This is what we can kind of flare out. We find a lot of boogers and hair. The hairs here are especially helpful for filtering out large dust particles. And for whatever reason, it seems like older fellows need a lot more. And that's why or maybe we just don't do a good job when we get older, getting rid of those. That's why, you can see them sticking out of their nose quite a bit. Nasal septum, talked already about this. Vertical partition divides the nasal cavity on the left and right sides. Anterior portion, as I mentioned earlier, is made up of hyaline cartilage. That's why it can be pierced. People get those pierced all the time. Not everybody, but many people do. Remainder is formed by your vomer, which is a singular bone, and then a perpendicular plate, which is part of the ethmoid. And then you've also got maxillae, so your upper jaws and your palatines, that also contribute a little bit to your nasal septum. As far as the nasal septum, the two most prominent portions of it, and this is one of the reasons I included this picture of a cadaver that's had their face essentially just removed. And vertically here you can see is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. That's the superior, about 2/3 or so, and then the inferior third or so is the vomer. Okay. Let's see. Inferiorly, the nasal cavity is bordered by both the hard and soft palate. Here we can only see the hard palate. This is the roof of your mouth towards the front. If we were to cut farther back, the soft palate is more towards the back of your mouth, made up of muscle, and that's what makes it soft. But those form the floor of your nasal cavity. Hard palate's formed by the palatine and maxillae bones. Laterally, walls of the internal nose are formed by the ethmoid, maxillae, lacrimal, palatine, and the inferior nasal concave bones. So quite a bit go into making the two lateral walls. And ethmoid bone, specifically what we call the cribriform plate, even though it's not labeled here, is what forms the roof of our nasal cavity. Deep within the nasal cavity, and we've talked about these before, 3 folds of tissue formed by facial bones, what we call the superior, middle, which are part of the ethmoid, and then a separate bone, the inferior nasal concave. Okay, concave with an E at the end is plural, concha with not an E at the end is singular. And these project from the lateral walls towards the septum, and as you can see here, it creates kind of these crevices, kind of irregularly shaped grooves, whatever you want to call them, to help with warming, cleaning, and humidifying the air as we breathe in it. So it's just not like an opening straight from our external nose into your throat. There's these passageways where the air has to pass. And the names of those are just superior, middle, and inferior nasal meatuses. Okay, so the grooves are the meatuses, the bone projections are the concave. We don't see it in this picture, but we've talked about this before. The receptors for the sense of smell are called olfactory receptors, and they lie in a region of membrane lining our superior nasal concave. So they're up towards the roof of our nasal cavity, and then adjacent septum called what we call the olfactory epithelium. Let me real quick open up that real quick. I can show you. We've seen this picture before, but show it to you again. So this is a sagittal section. Cut the head in half sideways here. So we're looking at the left side of the nasal cavity. This purple shaded area, the roof of our nasal cavity, essentially, is where that olfactory epithelium is, where we find all those receptors for the sense of smell. Now, before we move on completely from the nose, I want to talk about some things we've talked about before, the paranasal sinuses. Okay. These are air-containing spaces on our facial bones that open or drain into the nasal cavity, and they serve to lighten the skull and add what we call timbre or complexity to our voice. So make it a little bit unique for each and every one of us. I, in a normal semester, would be coloring these along with you, but I'll just point them out. It's fairly simple to identify them. The first two colored or labeled, excuse me, letter A, are the two frontal sinuses above your eyes, about the level of your eyebrows and your forehead. You can see them here in our frontal section, and then here in our lateral view, you can see one of them. And so if you ever get forehead pain when you get a cold, it's a good chance that this duct that connects into your nasal cavity has been clogged up. That extra mucus that we all produce when we get a cold or something like that. All right, letter B represents the sphenoid sinus, or sphenoidal sinus, found in the sphenoid bone. Can't see it really here labeled in this first picture, but if you just kind of go straight back from where my pointer is right now, you'd be able to find it. If you pinpointed it directly straight back from the nose, about where in front of your ear, your ear's right here, where those intersect is the singular sphenoidal sinus. Letter C are these little pockets right here, what we call ethmoidal air cells, ethmoidal sinuses, all found within the ethmoid bone. In fact, we can see some of them here on this previous page, these little pockets. These are the ones that always kind of give me the biggest issue. Feels like somebody just pinching on the bridge of my nose between my eyes when I get a cold. There are several of them. They're not singular. Each has their own connection into the nasal cavity, as we show here. Let's see what's next. Similar to those, we haven't actually talked about these much. Did mention them back when we talked about your temporal bones, but mastoid air cells don't actually open, and that's what these letter E's are showing here and back here. Don't connect to our nasal cavity. Instead, what they connect to is our middle ear cavity, also known as the tympanic cavity, which is where your ear bones are. Okay? If you think back to when we talked about our ears, we learned that there's a tube that connects our middle ear to our nasopharynx, which is the region of our pharynx just posterior to your nose, what we call the auditory tube or eustachian tube or pharyngotympanic tube, all the same thing, just labeled here as auditory tube. So these connect to this, which then connects to your throat, which then connects to your nose. So it's something I only really included because it was in the picture. Don't want you guys to be confused. They are associated with the nose, but it's like indirect, like a fifth cousin, essentially. Okay. Not nasal sinuses, but also included in this picture is what we call the nasolacrimal duct. Is what this tube here is showing you. We can only see it here in this left side of the face in this frontal view. Is that duct that carries tears that come across our eyes down into our nasal cavity and allow our nose to run whenever we're producing lots and lots of tears. So you guys can pause the video if you need to, color those in, make sure you identify them in case they're on the exam. All right, moving on. Mentioned a little bit about the pharynx already. This is a structure commonly we just call our throat. It's a funnel made up of skeletal muscle extending from the base of our skull to the level of our cricoid cartilage of our larynx, which we'll talk about the cricoid cartilage on the next page. Lies posterior to the nasal and oral cavities, so back behind your nose, behind your mouth. It's superior to the larynx, which is our voice box, and is anterior to your cervical vertebrae. We'll talk about this in this lecture. We'll also talk about it in our next lecture, because this is a common pathway for the respiratory digestive tracts. In other words, it carries air from our nose, from our mouth when we breathe in, into the larynx, and then down in the trachea, our windpipe. It also is what carries food and beverages that we ingest to our esophagus. Okay? So it's very important for breathing and eating and drinking, whatever. Okay? It's also important because it's a resonating chamber for speech. So that's where sounds help to be resonated. It's not where sound comes from. Sound comes from your larynx, which we'll talk about on the next page. And then something else very important, it houses our tonsils. If I zoom down to the picture, we've seen this picture before, back when we first introduced the tonsils, okay, which you can see are shown in our picture. Notice that this picture now includes a lot of other things that are labeled. I mentioned in that video that we would see this picture again and it would be a lot more complex than it was at that time. So here we are at that point. Okay, we'll talk about a lot of those things that are labeled there. First, I want to point out there are 3 parts that make up the pharynx. The superior portion of it's called the nasopharynx. This lies posterior to the nose. It extends to the inferior portion of your soft palate. Soft palate being the posterior portion of the roof of your mouth. 5 openings are associated with the nasopharynx. 2 internal nares, or 2 from the internal nares, which I talked a little bit about, are the openings from our internal nose. Here we can only see 1 section of our nose because this is a sagittal section. The internal nares is what's labeled. Remember, if it's an I, that means singular. Nares with an E means plural. Okay. There's 2 openings to the eustachian tubes. The eustachian tubes I talked about on the previous page are those auditory or pharyngotympanic tubes, same thing, connected to our middle ear. And then there's 1 opening into your oral pharynx, which is the second section of our pharynx. Associated with the nasopharynx, we have the pharyngeal or adenoid tonsil, singular tonsil. The nasopharynx is aligned with pseudostratified ciliated columnar. So it looks like there's multiple layers when there's actually 1. If you remember back when we talked about pseudostratified, pseudo means false. Ciliated means it has little cilia. The cells are nice and column shaped, tall and column. Cilia here helps to move mucus down toward the inferior portion of your pharynx. The oropharynx, located posterior behind the mouth, the soft palate to the level of the hyoid bone. Only 1 opening connected to it. That's the opening from the mouth, which is bracketed off here as what we call the fauces. Okay, that's the opening that we swallow into. Function of the oropharynx is for both respiratory and digestive purposes, whereas the nasopharynx strictly is respiratory because we're not ingesting food, beverages through our nose, at least in a normal situation. Oropharynx aligned with non-keratinized stratified squamous. Helps to protect against abrasion from food, and associated with it are the palatine and lingual tonsils, a pair of each, and which you can see are labeled here. Right here and here. The final and most inferior portion of your pharynx, called the laryngeal pharynx, extends from the hyoid bone to the esophagus, and it passes food into the esophagus posteriorly, which is where the location of the esophagus is. When we breathe in air, it passes that air into the larynx, which is anterior to the esophagus. It is lined by non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, and is also known as your hypopharynx. Okay, so a lot of stuff going on in this image. Kind of talk about some of these things. On the previous page, we talked about things like the sphenoid sinus associated with the sphenoid bone, pointing out the internal nares opening from your nose, pharyngeal or adenoid tonsil associated with your nasopharynx. There's the opening from your auditory tube in your middle ear, connected to your middle ear, say. Things we will talk about in our next lecture, since this is something that affects not only breathing, but also eating and drinking, would be things like your uvula, this little thing hanging down from your soft palate. Soft palate and the uvula are very important. Swallowing, what actually takes place when we swallow, your uvula, the thing that looks like a little punching bag in the back of your throat, closes off this whole area and prevents food and drinks from going up and into your nose. And fauces, palatine tonsil already kind of pointed out. Fauces is what we swallow the food through, the opening. In this case, the tongue's really pushed upwards against the roof of our mouth. But if our tongue is depressed, this whole area would be a lot more open. Okay. Oropharynx is where that food goes, and now if we breathe, air goes in there as well. Okay. On the next page, we'll talk about things like the epiglottis and the structures that make up the larynx, which includes thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage. The epiglottis is very important. It is a flap that will close off this whole set of pipes when we swallow. So it's like the uvula in that it prevents stuff from going up. In other words, it prevents food from going down into your windpipe and into your trachea, which causes you to choke. That way the food then can slide down into the posterior to what we call the esophagus. Okay, back up here in the nose, we can see the 3 nasal conchae. Little grooves are the meatuses that are labeled. There's the frontal sinus that we talked about on the previous page. There's the olfactory epithelium that I talked about. The nasal vestibule, that's the portion of our nose that we can kind of flare out, just internal to the external maris. Your maxilla, your palatine bone, collectively, I don't know why it's not labeled as such, but this would be your hard palate, different than your soft palate, which is made up of muscle. Tongue, obviously pointed that out. We talked about the tonsils, linguals, palatines before. Things we'll talk about on the next page or two are down here at the bottom, which includes things like the vocal cords, the larynx, the cartilages, etc. Okay, let's get on to the larynx. Okay, your larynx, also known as your voice box, more commonly known as your voice box, lies between the root of your tongue and the upper end of your trachea, just below and in front of your oropharynx. Consists largely of cartilages and are attached to one another into surrounding structures by muscles or more cartilage. Function of the larynx is to act as part of the airway to the lungs. So it is part of breathing, or it functions in breathing, and it is lined with a ciliated mucous membrane, helping to remove dust particles that we will inevitably breathe in. We call it the voice box because it's also the organ of voice production, done so by causing vibration on vocal folds, which produce sound. Okay, vocal folds, and we're labeled back here on this previous page. Okay. Now, the sounds are produced down in our larynx, with the size and shape of our nose, the mouth, the pharynx, and those bony air sinuses that I talked about help determine the characteristics of our voice. We use our tongue and our mouth especially to form words. Next time you're alone, you don't want to do this probably when someone's around, but try to speak without moving your tongue and make words. It's essentially impossible. There are a total of 9 cartilages that form the framework of the larynx. Includes something we pointed out on the previous page. The epiglottis, I mentioned, is a flexible flap of tissue, guards the superior opening of the larynx. The structure covers what we call the glottis, which is the upper region of the larynx. During swallowing, this is what it does. It prevents entrance of food, drink into our trachea. There's 2 parts that make it up. A stem, which is the tapered inferior portion, and is attached to the anterior ridge of the thyroid cartilage. The other portion is the leaf, broad superior portion that is unattached and free to move up and down like a trap door. Okay. Here we can see in an anterior view, posterior view, the tippy top of the epiglottis here, and then over here in our posterior view, we get that leaf and stem look at it. These are actually cadaver versions, so pictures of the same thing that we show up here. Pretty cool to see them labeled there. This is a sagittal section. You can see kind of the shape to it in the middle there. We've cut it in half. I'm not in love with that picture that much, so I won't really talk too much about it. The thyroid cartilage, also known as your Adam's apple, is that anteriorly projecting structure, helping to cover the anterior and lateral aspects of your larynx. It functions to protect the frontal larynx, and it's called an Adam's apple because it's typically larger in men. mainly due to the influence of male sex hormones, most notably being testosterone. There's a ligament known as the thyrohyoid membrane that connects your thyroid to your hyoid, which is why it's called the thyrohyoid membrane. Cricoid cartilage is the next. It's a ring of hyaline cartilage forming the inferior wall of the larynx and happens to be the landmark for making an emergency airway via a procedure called a tracheotomy. Connected to the first ring of tracheal cartilage by what's called a cricotracheal ligament, and is connected to the thyroid cartilage by a cricothyroid ligament. Okay. Some of those things, cricothyroid ligament, are labeled cricotracheal ligaments labeled over here and is down here. Not something that's super important. Best really view here to show it of these two would be the posterior view, and that's because in this picture it's covered up by the thyroid gland. Here the thyroid has been removed, so we get a good view of it in our anterior and posterior views. Together, the thyroid and the cricoid essentially constitute the box of your trachea, or excuse me, of your larynx, the voice box. The next 6 are all in pairs, so a pair of arytenoids, corniculates, and cuneiforms round us out. The arytenoids are posterior to the thyroid cartilage, and they're going to serve as attachment point for your vocal folds. They contain elastic ligaments that vibrate when skeletal muscles move them into path of outgoing air to produce sounds. And the arytenoids are going to be shown right here and here. They're not labeled, but they would be here and here in our picture. At the very tip of those are what we call the corniculates, our next pair. These are horn-shaped pieces of elastic cartilage at the apex of each arytenoid. And then finally, there's the pair of cuneiforms, club-shaped elastic cartilage anterior to the corniculates. The only view that we can see them in, and it's really kind of the main reason I included this, was the sagittal section view. But the function of these cuneiforms, which are labeled right here, are to support the vocal folds and lateral aspects of the epiglottis. Okay. As far as the inner lining of your larynx, it's made up of mucous membrane. It contains 2 pairs of folds. Superior pair is called the vestibular folds, or your false vocal cords, and then the inferior pair is called the vocal folds, which are your true vocal cords. And you can see are labeled here and here in this picture. And then we're back up here in this picture. And the book gets into a lot more detail about how those vocal cords work and how we produce sounds. It's pretty intricate and complicated, so I didn't include it since it's, as an anatomy class. But you can learn about it. You can read in your textbook. It's pretty interesting. All right, moving down to the trachea. Also known as your windpipe. It's flexible tubular structure just beneath the larynx, approximately 12 centimeters to 5 inches in length, 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch in diameter. Extends from your larynx to the superior border of your 5th thoracic vertebrae, where it divides into right and left primary bronchi. It is located anterior to the esophagus and is made up of stacked rings of cartilage with fibrous bases. And we can see at least the beginning of it here on this page and in this page. Okay. The wall of your trachea is made up of 4 layers. The inner layer is called the mucosa. It's made up of an epithelial layer of pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. And then it's got an underlying layer of lamina propria, which is connective tissue where you find elastic and reticular fibers. Within the mucosa are mucus-producing cells called goblet cells. There's also ciliated columnar cells that help move via the way of that cilia, move the mucus up towards the pharynx. What that mucus does is it traps the dust particles that weren't trapped above, back up in the larynx or in your pharynx. So when the dust gets that far down, it still gets trapped thanks to the mucus, and then the cilia helps push that upwards, where we can then kind of cough it up. Or in some cases, what actually happens is that mucus and the dust gets pushed down into your esophagus, and then we push it into our stomach to be digested, which sounds really gross, but super effective. Superficial to your mucosa is the submucosa. layer of areolar connective tissue. And then the third layer is made up of cartilage, hyaline cartilage, and 16 to 20 total, roughly C-shaped rings wrapping around the submucosa. Now notice C has this shape to it. And so there's an opening, and we could see that here in our picture. This is a cadaver looking down at the top of one of those tracheal cartilages. The C opening is not actually completely open, and that's because there's a membrane in there, what we call a fibromuscular membrane, which is home to a muscle that I'll talk about here in a second. So open part of each C-shaped ring faces posteriorly toward the esophagus and is spanned by a fibromuscular membrane, where a smooth muscle known as the trachealis muscle is found. This muscle allows your trachea to change its diameter slightly when we inhale. So what it can do is cause your trachea to kind of squeeze more shut or more open. Your trachea will never completely collapse, and that's because of those rings, and the rigidity of those rings prevents them from collapsing when we inspire, when we breathe in. The final layer of your trachea, the outer layer, is made up of areolar connective tissue. We call it adventitia, and it just functions to just basically hold your trachea in place, connecting it to other things. Okay, moving on from your trachea, which we see here. Before entering your lungs, your trachea branches to form the beginning of what we call our bronchial tree, a branching system of air tubes found within our lungs. And they also help divide our chest into right and left structures, carry gases into the right and left lungs. The first two branches are called primary or main bronchi. There's two of them total, a right main or right primary, which goes to the right lung, and then a left primary or left main that goes to your left lung. Okay. Branching from them are secondary or lobar bronchi, branches of the main or primary. There's one of these for each lobe of your right and left lung. Okay. You can see they are labeled here as such. Okay. If you look in this picture, which includes the right lung and the left lung, we see that your right lung has 1, 2, 3 lobes, whereas your left lung only has 2 lobes. Okay. So that means the right lung is going to have 3 lobar bronchi, or secondary, as they're also known as, a right superior, a middle, and an inferior. The left lung is only going to have a left superior and a left inferior. Okay. Why your right lung has more lobes than your left lung is due to this space right here, called the cardiac notch, which is where your heart rests. If you think back to when we talked about the heart a few weeks ago, we learned that the apex of your heart points over to the left side. It kind of sits on your diaphragm, and so your left lung is a little bit smaller than your right lung. It has 1 less lobe to it. Okay. Branching off of your secondary, lobar bronchi or tertiary or segmental bronchi. There's 1 of these for each of what we call the bronchopulmonary segments, which is why they're called segmental bronchi, of the right and left lungs, and they're named as such. I won't really get into the names of the lung segments, but the textbook does. Branching from those are what we call bronchioles. These are going to be surrounded by smooth muscle. Size-wise, they're a millimeter or less in diameter, so we're getting down to very, very tiny things. The very final branch of the bronchial tree are called terminal bronchioles, less than a ½ millimeter in diameter, where they then subdivide into microscopic branches called respiratory bronchioles. And then budding from those respiratory bronchioles are the air-filled cells that I talked about earlier, the alveoli, little grapes, which we'll talk about more on the next slide. Before moving on to the next slide, I want to talk about what happens as we get more extensive in branching in our bronchial tree. 3 major things take place. Okay, take a break here. Mucous membrane in a bronchial tree changes from pseudostratified ciliated columnar, our primary, secondary, and tertiary, to ciliated simple columnar with some goblet cells. Goblet cells, remember, produce mucus in our larger bronchioles, to mostly ciliated simple cuboidal with no goblet cells in our smaller bronchioles, to mostly non-ciliated simple cuboidal in our terminal. So essentially, the farther in we go, the smaller and smaller we get. We see less and less cilia, we see less and less mucus. Because at that point, hopefully we've already trapped and moved what we needed out. As we move in, plates of cartilage are gradually replaced by incomplete rings of cartilage in our primary bronchi before completely disappearing in our distal. So more inward we go, less cartilage. And as that cartilage decreases, the amount of smooth muscle increases. And smooth muscle is easier to control. By way of relaxing that muscle, we can allow for dilation of our airways, which can allow us to breathe in more deeply, bring in more air. Unfortunately, this is the smooth muscle that can also pinch shut when a person has an asthma attack. So kind of a bad thing about that for those of us who have asthma. Over on the right side of the page, I included a picture of a cadaver anteriorly and posteriorly, showing you not only the structure of the larynx, trachea, but also the bronchial tree. What they've essentially done is removed the lung tissue surrounding the bronchial tree. So it's pretty cool to see those structures and how they kind of get smaller and smaller. What we can't see, obviously, are the microscopic ones, but we can see the bigger ones anyway. Speaking of microscopic, let's talk about alveoli. The little grapes where we perform gas exchange, primarily anyway, performing what we call pulmonary external respiration, exchanging carbon dioxide and oxygen. I've talked about alveolar ducts and sacs before, but I will point them out again. What we're looking at in this picture is a lobule of the lung, so very small section of our lung. We see the very tips of our tree branches, the terminal bronchioles, which then extend out and become microscopic respiratory bronchioles. From there, the alveolar ducts branch off. So these are like the stems of our grape cluster, carry that air into the entire cluster, we call an alveolar sac, and then each of the little balls in that cluster is called an alveolus. Alveoli are plural. Okay, what this picture is not showing you, and I mentioned it earlier, is the fact that each alveolus is going to be very densely surrounded by pulmonary capillaries. We just don't show it for these, but we do over here, providing for a ready reserve of blood where that gas can be exchanged. Okay. Let's see. As far as the alveoli, they're very thin, only one cell thick, as are the pulmonary capillaries. The walls of the capillaries are only one cell thick, making them very thin and easy for oxygen to leave the alveoli, pass through the walls and into the blood, and CO2 to go the other way. So a gas exchange is going to occur with very little resistance. I mentioned earlier, we have tons and tons of them, millions of them in each lung, so surface area available for gas exchange is very high. Now, looking down here in this picture, we show what the structure of a singular alveolus looks like. Okay. The walls are composed of cells called type 1 cells. Okay. Type 1 cells are squamous, so they're flat, plate-like. Okay. See, here's one, here would be another, okay, and they create the ball-like shape to them. Okay. Notice directly surrounding them are the pulmonary capillaries, which are also made up of squamous-shaped, what we call endothelial cells. Together, the walls of our, how do I say it? Together, the type 1 cells of our alveoli, the capillary endothelium, and what we call their two basement membranes, collectively form what's called a respiratory membrane. This is the barrier for which oxygen must travel through to get into the blood, and CO2 the opposite way from the blood into the alveolus. So it's a barrier for gas exchange. The great thing about it is, in a normal healthy lung, it's pretty much non-existent. I mean, it's so thin, I want to say like 0.0004 millimeters. It's like paper thin, maybe even thinner than that. So if you have healthy lungs, gases are going to be exchanged rather easily. Okay. Now notice in this picture, we also have labeled things like type 2 cells, also known as septal cells. These produce a very important chemical called surfactant. Okay? This is found on the inside of each alveolus, and it helps reduce what we call surface tension, which is a force of attraction between water molecules that's found in the fluid. What ultimately it does is it prevents the alveoli from collapsing and sticking together as we inspire, expire, so as we breathe. And really important is it helps with oxygen diffusion. Other cells, we find alveolar macrophages or dust cells. This is what green one here looks like, or is. They are going to clean up anything that we haven't removed already. Fine dust, bacteria, that kind of stuff that we breathed in and it's made its way into the alveoli. We also find present our fibroblasts, connective tissue cells, producing reticular elastic fibers. Okay. Over here, essentially is kind of like what we're seeing right here. The inside of an alveolus looks like, the walls, you can see the cells making it up, you can see the blood vessels and stuff surrounding the alveoli. Down here is looking at the airways, the terminal bronchial. It becomes very thin-walled respiratory bronchial, the ducts that lead to the millions and millions of alveoli that are labeled there. So some pretty cool stuff in our pictures. Okay, that brings us now to just talk about the lungs as a whole. Cone-shaped organs consisting of a broad concave base, which is going to rest on your diaphragm. So this is the widest portion. And then it comes to a point, kind of like our heart did, except the point, what we call the apex of our lungs, points up, not down. And it actually points up just above our clavicle. You need to think of your lungs not like a balloon, which is a hollow structure, but instead, and I wish we got to dissect the cats, because it's really cool to see that our lungs, actually put your fingers, using gloves, on them, feel how squishy they are, because they're more like a sponge. Okay? They do have those balloons. Those sacs are called alveoli that we just talked about. But the lungs themselves that contain those balloons are really nice and squishy. Okay? Our lungs lie against the ribs both anteriorly and posteriorly. And the surface of our lungs lying against our ribs is called the costal surface. Anytime you see the word costal, it refers to lungs. And it actually matches the curvature of our ribs. You can actually see little grooves in our lungs here, in our two lateral views of the right and left lungs, respectively, where those ribs are, or ribs were anyway, because those are from cadavers that have been removed. Mediastinal or medial surface of each lung contains a hilum. We've seen the word hilum now a couple times. This is an indented portion of an organ, in this case the lungs. This is where the primary bronchi, pulmonary blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves enter and exit each lung. Our hyla are held together by pleura and connective tissue, what we collectively call the root of the lung, which is what we can see here in our pictures, cadavers on the right, and then these are animated versions. All right, left lung, I talked about on the previous page, contained the cardiac notch, or a couple pages, I guess now, concave portion where our heart lies. Right lung does not have that. Mentioned that there are lobes and then functional units called bronchopulmonary segments that make up our lungs. Each of those segments served by a tertiary bronchopulmonary segments are then divided into lobules. Actually, I go back to the previous page. Here's what one lobule looks like. Those lobules served by a terminal bronchiole. Mentioned our left lung has two lobes separated by what we call an oblique fissure. And this is that angled sideways fissure, creating a superior and an inferior lobe. Your right lung has two fissures, horizontal and then an oblique fissure, creating a superior, middle, and an inferior lobe. Okay. Each lung is covered superficially by a structure known as a pleura, which is double layered membrane. If you think back to our actual first lecture of the semester, we talked about this just a little bit. It's a lot like the pericardium that we just talked about with the heart. There's a pulmonary or visceral pleura, that is a deeper layer. It covers each surface of the lung. And then a parietal pleura, which is superficial to that, lining the walls of the thoracic cavity. Now, I always going to use my hands to demonstrate the relationship of these two membranes. And I always tell students to think of them like your two hands that have been glued together. And so when they're glued together, they're hard to separate. And the same thing exists for these two membranes. And they can pull apart, but they like to snap back together. If you pull your right hand, your left hand follows with. And there is a space between them, what we call a pleural cavity or pleural space. But notice here I have it listed as a potential space. And it's not really a true space in that, like I said, they like to stick together. Okay? There is a fluid in there called pleural fluid, which is a lubricant that keeps them from having friction on one another. But it also helps maintain a vacuum that helps them stick together. And if you do get air in that space, it's called a pneumothorax. You can get blood in there, it's called a hemothorax. Either of those situations would be a good thing. Now, the importance of that relationship and as they stick together is that when our diaphragm contracts and pulls downward, it's going to pull the parietal pleura. So the parietal pleura comes and extends outward. So does the pulmonary or visceral pleura. And in doing so, that makes our lungs bigger, and that's what draws air into our lungs. And so that's how we breathe in. And then when we relax that diaphragm, everything goes back the other way, and that forces air out. So the very cool thing takes place every day as we breathe in and out. Okay, last thing I want to do is just summarize something that we talked about not too long ago, which is the relationship that exists between blood and breathing. Okay, so talking about the flow of blood from our heart via our right ventricle in the pulmonary trunk, and then by way of your pulmonary arteries to your lungs. And then within the lungs, the pulmonary capillaries are the blood vessels where we perform gas exchange, which means oxygen can enter the blood, CO2 can exit the blood, and then that oxygenated blood can come back to the right atrium, or excuse me, left atrium, and then out the left ventricle, and so on and so on and so on, that we've talked about before. And we've talked about this, and you guys had several questions on your last exam about this. One thing I do want to point out, though, number 5 here, is that our lungs, our bronchi, trachea, they all have their own network of blood vessels, just like our heart had its own network of blood vessels. Remember, we talked about the coronary circulation. We have to feed our lungs. We have to feed our trachea. We have to feed all those bronchial tubes, because the oxygen that's inside of them is not there long enough for diffusion to occur. So, nothing too crazy there on the last page. We've talked about that before. All right, and that wraps us up. Fairly short lecture, but a lot in there. So we'll see you next time for the digestive system.